Hello and welcome everyone to the video. And in this video we're going to discuss the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, who is one of the most influential 20th century philosophers and a very influential philosopher in general. And it examines Husserl's project of developing what he calls a presuppositionless philosophy. And so we're going to be going into what that means through his method of phenomenology, which is a method that aims to uncover the essential structures of human consciousness. And the discussion will highlight the challenges and limitations of Husserl's approach, and also acknowledge its merits and its place within the broader continental and also broader philosophical tradition in general. So, who was Edmund Husserl? Well, he was like I said, one of the most influential figures in 20th century philosophy. And this is despite the fact, or perhaps because of the fact, that he is a particularly difficult philosopher to interpret. His style is extremely recondite. His writings are voluminous, almost to the point of compulsiveness. And he has a tendency to construct neologisms and new terms to correspond to the new paths that he is breaking into the realm of the psyche and also the realm of the mind. Husserl, his early background was in mathematics, which is very important because he is, perhaps like all mathematicians, a sort of closet Platonist. I think that mathematicians on the whole tend to look for something universal and abstract in all the thinking that they do. And Husserl, who got his PhD under a man named Weierstrass in Germany back in the 1880s, he has a definite set of Platonic tendencies and commitments. So when you read his philosophy, when you think about Husserl's work, if you were to connect it and think of it in terms of Plato and the Cartesian tradition, the tradition of Western rationalism and idealism, you'd be on the right track at the very least. Now, like Descartes, what Husserl wished to do was to connect a new foundation for knowledge. And it's a radical epistemological move which attempts to create certainty in the face of contingency and the uncertainty that is generated by other realms of knowledge. So in some respects, perhaps like Kant, what Husserl's project involves is finding a presuppositionless foundation to human knowledge. And what this would be is a sort of science of sciences, if you will. And it would inform and direct and correct all the other activities of the human mind, including natural science. So what Husserl is trying to do is get down to the Urstoff, the bedrock of the human psyche, and from there to generate all other realms of knowledge which correspond to it. In some respects, this is like the Cartesian project of looking into oneself, and after finding an indubitable foundation for that and for the contents of your mind, to move from there to generating the external world. So like Descartes, Husserl is working on the assumption that, first of all, the self is self-evident. In other words, it's not controversial that we are selves and that we have selves and that we are conscious. He takes that to be simply a given, and that it is indubitable. And not only is that indubitable, the interesting thing about it is that the knowing self, the cogito, is, in Husserl's view, both temporally and logically prior to the world that is known by the cogito. So in other words, the knower comes before what is known. That has to come first. And if you think about the idealist tradition, all these guys believe that the self has to come first. Think about Descartes, think about Spinoza, think about Kant. The whole idealist or rationalist tradition tends to emphasize inwardness, internality. And perhaps that's not only an important characteristic of Husserl, but I would be inclined to say that that's one of the most characteristic moves, the characteristic intellectual developments of continental philosophy in general. And so in other words, this Continental that has this preference, this preference for inwardness and consciousness, subjectivity, and unlike the Anglo-American tradition, which looks outward like Hume does, and develops a theory about the external world, and then afterwards, as a sort of postscript, develops a theory of the psyche, of the mind, what's internal to a human being. Well, the Continental tradition does the opposite. They start out with a theory of what's inside, and then from there try to work outwards. And both the Anglo-American tradition and the Continental tradition suffer from a sort of common problem. When they try to make the jump from one realm to the other, so for example, what we might call the exocosm to the... When Anglo-Americans try to make the jump from the exocosm to the internal realm, the psyche, the soul, or the mind, which we could call the introcosm, there's always a problem in leaping that hurdle, and it goes vice versa as well. So it doesn't really matter which side you start on. The problem is always going to be the same. How do we move from one part of the hurdle to the other? How do we move from the beginning to the end? So when you look at Husserl, when you look at this Cartesian Continental tradition, keep that in mind. They're starting out with the internal facts of human consciousness in this Continental tradition, and then generating the world from that. So it's a very different problematic. It's a different starting point. And so when you're looking at Husserl, you have to very much keep that in mind. Now, corresponding to this way of developing a philosophy is the hope of getting certain knowledge, like Descartes. So Descartes' whole project of radical skepticism was to develop a knowledge that was foundational and completely certain. Husserl is trying to do the same thing. He's sort of a neo-Cartesian, if you will. And much of his work, when you actually start to read the stuff that he's published, because although he produced a tremendous amount of writing, most of what he produced was not published in his lifetime. And I must say, it was a voluminous writing. He produced almost 45,000 pages of work, and it tends to be very repetitive. It's methodological for the most part, and particularly programmatic. In other words, what his writings are about is how we engage in a method, which he calls phenomenology, which will allow us to discern these eternal essences that exist within the human psyche. And once we identify these essences, then we will know ourselves. And once we know ourselves clearly and in a way that can't be doubted, that can be called into question. Then, only then, when we have this certain knowledge that can't be called into question, can we construct all the other elements of knowledge. So what Husserl wants is what he described as a philosophy as a rigorous science, which is a very radical sort of idea. I mean, by the 20th century, I think very few thinkers are willing to say that philosophy is not only a rigorous science, but it's the foundation, the ore of knowledge of all other possible cognition. So this is it's a play that tries to go for all the marbles, basically. He's trying to win the big philosophical game, if you will. And if he fails to do that, and I think he does, in fact, fail, I think that we have to admire the sort of nobility which tries to take on a huge intellectual project like that. Because in many respects, because Husserl himself, as a man rather than a philosopher, was a kind of a saintly individual. He was conspicuous for his dedication and his devotion and his moral seriousness to philosophy. I would almost be tempted to compare him to Don Quixote, because, we all laugh at the results of Don Quixote's misadventures because, they're a bit silly and he misunderstands the way the world works. But on the other hand, no one laughs at Don Quixote's intentions. They are intrinsically noble, and we have no choice but to admire that. I kind of feel the same way about Husserl. I think that the project, not only does it not complete itself, it never completely gets started. I mean, it does get started in the sense that some of his first logical investigations are still very relevant, but once he takes this transcendental idealist turn, it gets to be a misadventure, I'll say that. But he was on the track. What he wanted to do basically was the equivalent of the quest for the Holy Grail. And even if we never find it, there is something excellent, something noble about that quest. And I say this initially in this video of Husserl because I'm going to be kind of hard on him later on, and I think that's deserving. So I think we should give him a little bit of slack, at least initially, because he's trying to do something that, if it's not impossible, it is certainly exceedingly difficult. And it's much more ambitious than the local, small, individual projects that are characteristic of the Anglo-American tradition. First off, he starts off with the idea of certainty and intuition. In other words, if we're going to examine ourselves in a phenomenological way, if we're going to pursue this method of phenomenology, we're going to have to find out what the procedure for knowing things is, what phenomenology involves as a method, what it investigates, and how it investigates it. Those are always going to be informed, and since this is a methodological approach, it makes sense to talk about how we do this as opposed to what we do. And one of the big issues here is the question of intuition. Now, perhaps when you hear me use the word like intuition, particularly because we live in contemporary America, or also Europe and just the world in general, we are in thrall of the Anglo-American tradition, and you may put this in italics or something, but and the reason for that is because intuition is kind of a squishy, fishy, sort of mushy, messy category, if you will. And I want to start out by suggesting that that's not always the case, and that, in fact, it might be true some of the time, but I can imagine intuitions, and I'm going to help you imagine some intuitions, which are not only not controversial, but they're not mushy, and they're not really doubtable. So here are some ideas. First of all, do I have a headache? You don't know that. Only I know that. How about someday do I want to be elected president of the United States? Again, you don't know that. Only I can know that. How do I feel about spinach? Unless I've told you before, if I'm just meeting you right now, there's no way you can know. And so my point is that the answer to these questions, even though you can't know, I know if I have a headache or not. And what somebody else external to me presume to tell me, they can't tell me that I do or do not have a headache. You can't correct me on that matter until I tell you about it. So it's silly. Well, so what I'm going to suggest is that my knowledge of my headache is a direct intuition of my experience, my psychic state. And I don't need anybody else to tell me out there, And if you doubt that, you say, no, Aaron, you don't have a headache. What am I supposed to do? Do some math to show you that I do or don't have a headache? Or should we go to a lab and do some experiments to show you that I have a headache? Maybe in 50 years or something we'll have technology like that. But you can't tell that about if I like spinach or something. I don't think we're quite there yet. So these are the sort of intuitions I guess you could get across that only you as a self-conscious being would have knowledge about, and nobody else would have knowledge about it. Even if you told them, you could be lying. So intuition then perhaps is not so squishy as we might imagine, because there are certain things that only we can validate just by our own experience of them. And maybe these are bad examples, or these are examples that will be outdated in 20, 50 years, but there will be new examples that will pop up that will be relevant to this sort of concept, this category that we call intuition. And in that respect, oddly enough, phenomenology, Husserl's method that he develops, and empiricism, the method of somebody like David Hume, even though they are so different in many respects, they share a common property, and that they're all ultimately based on our experience. Hume's phenomenalism, his empiricism, is based on our experience of the external world, on observing that external world, and Husserl's phenomenology, alternatively, is based on our experience of the internal world, and reduces only to that. And there's nothing further that we can gesture at. So on the one hand, I would recommend that you look at this with a certain degree of skepticism. In other words, intuition can be a very squishy category. It can be nebulous, and it can be a simple refusal to give reasons for what you believe. And usually the refusal to give a reason philosophically for what you believe is a way of saying that you don't have good reasons for what you believe. But my point here is that that's not always the case. If you think about the idea of intuition in terms of questions like, do you have a headache? I believe you will realize that I'm the only one who knows that, or you're the only one who knows that. And that's not absurd or meaningless, for me to say that I have a headache or for you to say the same thing. So I'm just trying to establish the idea of intuition as not being intrinsically preposterous. Now, Husserl was a student of a man named Franz Brentano, which is a very interesting fact because Freud was also one of Brentano's students. And from Brentano, apparently, who was, a very influential teacher, and who I'll probably do a video on in the future if I have not already, Husserl, as did Freud, borrowed this idea of intentionality. And it revolves around the proposition that the facts of mental life, our psychic life, are irreducible. And what intentionality means, it doesn't mean the regular sort of commonplace meaning of intention, which intention would be, you get in your car and you have the intent to drive to the store to pick up groceries. That's not the type of intention Brentano was talking about. His was more about the aboutness or the directedness of mental thoughts. And he thought that all mental acts, if you will, ACTS, acts, all mental acts had this aboutness, this directedness towards something. And so, in other words, we can't talk about love and hate and hope and guilt and desire and lust in terms of purely chemicals. Freud liked the idea that ultimately we could reduce one to the other, but in practice he treated it as a sort of autonomous inquiry into the mind. Well, something analogous is happening when we look at Husserl. He believes that the facts of mental life are irreducible and they're real. And not only are they irreducible and real, but they come first. They are prior to the external world. In other words, what Husserl wants to do is like the project, like Descartes. He wants to construct the self first and out of that build nature, rather than, say, the empiricist project of constructing nature first and then later on constructing the self. So the self comes first in phenomenology. And how do you find out about yourself? Well, intuition. And the reason why it's important for me to establish intuition is because otherwise this seems like a tremendously nebulous, sort of baggy activity. But in fact, it potentially could be more precise than what we might immediately imagine. Now, what's the problem Husserl wants to solve? Well, in one of his most accessible books, and if you intend to read Husserl, it can be quite trying because of the way he writes and the way it's been translated into English. But one place I would recommend you start is probably The Philosophy and the Crisis of European Man. And it's one of his last works. It was published in 1936. It was written in probably the early 1930s. And he dies in 1938, right in the middle of World War II. And the reason why this is a good introduction to Husserl is because it's easier to figure out what Husserl is against than to figure out what he is for. And the things that he are against are things like historicism, relativism, psychologism, and scientism. And what he's gesturing at here is the whole tendency of thought since the Enlightenment, which tends to move away from theological or more precisely metaphysical structures toward the emphasis on the empirical external world. Perhaps this might be an homage to the rise of modern natural science, but Husserl says that the rise of modern natural science has misled us. It has caused us to misunderstand the world around us and has put philosophy on the wrong footing. The result of this has been an impoverishment of our culture. In some ways, I would say that Husserl's concerns are fundamentally cultural. He's putting together his epistemological project in order to rescue us from the degeneration into a sort of pure materialism. And what Husserl thinks, at least his self-conception is that he's kind of renewing and reviving the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition of Greek rationalism, where our logos, our rationality, applies to the whole domain of human experience. Juxtapose this to the tradition of scientism that we see in Mach and Averroes and all the other positivistic Germans. And there he calls the tradition of Democritus. Those of you who know the Greek philosopher Democritus will know that he reduced the world to atoms in the void. Well, in some ways, that's the modern scientific projects. That's what they have done. And so Husserl says this is a wrong turn. We've moved down an intellectual sort of cul-de-sac. And what he's trying to do and say is that we must go back to this Greek rationalism. And so it's very interesting to know about the things in the external world to us. But the really important thing for us is to know ourselves, is to know our internal world. And then we will be able to construct our knowledge of the external world in an undubitable foundation, basically. But if we start with the external world and its contingencies and its meaninglessness and its messiness and its lack of certainty, all other intellectual activities, including our knowledge of ourselves, is going to reflect that same contingency and uncertainty. So while the project may not be entirely successful, the program that he's formulating is in fact reasonable and serious and ought to be taken with great care. So we're going to move against the general tendency of Western culture since the breakup of the Middle Ages, let's say. And there's this decidedly scholastic element to Husserl's work as well. And it's an infinite working out of carefully constructed logical oppositions in a sort of tautological way. The construction of elaborate tautologies is perhaps one of the characteristic philosophical problems of mathematicians who eventually become philosophers. And, what were they going to do with their training? Constructing tautologies and working out the implications of definitions. That's what they're trained to do. Well, that's what Husserl's whole project is, basically. And that he moves from the domain of space or quantity to the whole domain of human experience is a very noble and exciting project. And so, we're going to dive into it and see what we can make out of it, if we can make some sort of sense out of it. So like I said, one great starting point is this philosophy and the crisis of European man. And he wrote it when he was a philosopher at the University of Freiburg, which he was until about 1933, when he was dismissed from this university because he was Jewish. And National Socialism in Germany, it came in, and he gets replaced by one of his students, Martin Heidegger, which I'm sure you are aware of. And so at the same time, it seems clear enough that to Husserl that Western culture is collapsing, and he's starting to have these make stronger arguments for this. And so one of the results of this, Democritian tradition, let's say, as opposed to the revived Platonic Aristotelian tradition, is the fact that value distinction emerges. We get various kinds of relativisms all over the place. We get various kinds of pure will to power, voluntaristic philosophies, all of these things that, according to Husserl, are a sign of cultural degeneration. And the source of this cultural degeneration is our lack of knowledge of ourselves and the world around us. So what he's trying to do is sort of like Ajax. If you know the Iliad, Ajax is trying to prevent the Trojans from burning Greek ships, and he stands there and will not move. And there is something tremendously heroic about it. Even though, he may be fighting phantom battles, he thinks at the very least, Husserl now, that what he's doing is absolutely essential to the project of our culture, as Ajax does, to prevent the burning of the Greek ships. And so what is the problem? Well, the problem that we're going to find, one of the problems, of this procedure that we're looking into ourselves, is that it could easily become frivolous or arbitrary. In other words, once I look into myself, I suppose I could tell you the immediate contents of my experience, but the problem is that would be arbitrary and completely subjective. That's not going to give us an ultimate foundation for knowledge, for the external world around us. So we have to do something with our looking into ourselves, with our turning inward. And what Husserl wants us to do is use a method for examining the contents of our psyche, And that method will be called Phenomenology. And what he will do is something also called the Epoché in this phenomenological tradition. And this is a translation of the idea of suspension. So like Descartes, when he says, I'm going to doubt the whole external world, what Husserl wants to do is, first of all, suspend the whole external world. It's not that he disbelieves in it, at least initially. He's going to be skeptical of the existence of tables and chairs, the way Descartes did in the Discourse on Method. He's not denying their existence per se. Again, at least initially, we can take this various ways. He's just saying that the whole external world is irrelevant, and so we should bracket it, basically, in the strict mathematical sense of bracketing a problem. Because remember, he had his training as a mathematician, and so we're going to bracket the problem of the external world for now and leave all that stuff out. And bracketing this external world means that we're going to leave out a great deal of human experience. For example, this will leave out things like cause and effect relationships. Why? Because, as Hume points out, we don't see cause and effect in the world. We just see one thing happening after another. All scientific theorems will be left out. Mathematical deductions will be left out. We're going to be left with the pure, raw data of being a human being. And what Husserl thinks is that there's something common to us all. That's what we're going to discern here. And now you might think of it as something like this. You know, what is it to sift out sand, let's say? To look at something hidden in the sand. Well, what he's trying to do is sift out all the contents of human experience and find out the stuff that doesn't pass through the mesh of phenomenology, basically. So he's going to create this mesh and then see what sort of human experience is left. And what we hold on to is what Husserl calls an essence, some invariable necessary quality to human experience. And when we collect these essences together and reduce them still further, I think that's what we get, something in common, something, the Urstoff, the foundation, the bedrock of the human psyche. And so, you could think of it like the idea of reduction. Reduction is a funny word. It comes from Latin, and it means to lead back. So we're going to be led back to our original kind of primal consciousness. And you could think of it as a boiling down, basically. And so in the search for essences, imagine consciousness as this big whale. You've got to put it in a pot and boil away all the stuff that's irrelevant so that you can get something that's essential and structural and permanent there. And this longing for something essential and structural and permanent, you can definitely hear the ghost of Plato here, right? And it's a typical intellectual move of somebody that's trained in mathematics. And you could also hear the ghost of Aristotle as well, who had these essences, focal meanings too. And so, I'd say probably Plato and Aristotle they had this tremendous influence on the subsequent development of Continental philosophy, and particularly people like Heidegger. In the process of developing a presuppositionless philosophy, what we're going to find is that something like the shape of the ego's transparent cage. Like Kant, Husserl is going to tell us what the necessary limitations of our experience are. And once he's done that, he will think that he has done it permanently for all of time in the way that any mathematician or Platonist would. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is to find some certain knowledge with which to combat historicism, or scientism that we get, with the positivists, let's say, or various kinds of relativism, and the way we're going to combat that is by boiling down with this epoche. And this is the first case. What we'll do is we'll have some sort of purified subjectivity. We'll boil down till we get the essential constructs from the human minds, from which the human minds are made of. And the result of that boiling down will be the authentic reality of our experience to be disclosed. So we're going to suspend our belief in the external world and just examine what's left over. And what do we find? Well, what's left over after we perform this kind of activity of reduction, will be these essences that are permanent and eternal. And he will know then the structure of the human mind, and these will always be, they will always have a certain similar set of characteristics, and phenomenological statements will result from this phenomenological examination of the external contents of our psyche. And the key thing here is that it's not empirical in the sense that I can observe it, or that you can observe it, or that a scientist with a bunch of probes can observe it. It's not an empirical activity in this sense. It will be descriptive, but it won't be, describe anything out there in the external world. It's going to describe exclusively the stuff that's in here in my internal consciousness. And so it's going to be a descriptive theory of the introcosm, of the interworld. And what he's looking for is an absolute certainty without presuppositions, and it will always be about internal, intentional actions. And so, in fact, what he's trying to do here is derive a priori statements. So if you remember Kant and what he said, what a priori statement is, it has at least two qualities. One is that it's not empirical, and two, it's necessarily true. So what he wants to find is to generate, after looking into his own psyche in this phenomenological way, sifting out the contingent and the arbitrary and the irrelevant, an a priori certain truth about what it means to be a human being. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem, you might want to say, is that after this reduction, what we're getting is something like immediate, direct apprehension of what the scholastics call universals. So we're looking directly into the self, and since the self constructs and projects the world, we're going to cogitate ourselves and bootstrap ourselves into something permanent, into some permanent reality. Now, there are many difficulties with this. Some of them, we should look at directly. So first of all, there are very few examples in Husserl's work of actually doing this. One of the problems with phenomenology, the nebulous, baggy quality about it, is that he says the first thing we have to do is figure out what the phenomenological method is. And the way we develop the phenomenological method is to use phenomenology on itself, to inspect yourself. So there's something kind of fishy going on here at first. In order to find out about what phenomena is, remember in the Greek, phenomena is what is disclosed, what is, apparent, directly known. Well, in order to find out what a phenomena is, one of the things we're going to do is reduce the idea of phenomena to find out what that essentially is. And from there, we'll be able to move directly on. So it's a method that hopes to pull itself up by its own bootstraps, if you will. And, and there's some problems logically with this activity. So let me give you an example. So to flesh this out a little bit. And so Husserl himself was generating things like investigations of phenomena, but also ideas like number, meaning, truth, pure abstractions that he believes are common to all cognitive beings. Okay. And in every case, we end up with some sort of circle, what he calls an epistemological circle, and at other times a methodological circle. But the reasoning always ends up being circular. And if you're going to restrict yourself to the domain of internality, what else could you be doing by talking about circular things in a circular way? Where is there to go, basically? It's almost not even a circle, it's something like a point. It lacks an interior quality. And so his method, or the method that he uses more often than any other, because it's very difficult to figure out exactly what this amounts to, is what he calls free imaginative variation. Now, what does that look like? Well, it's basically how we search for essences, that sort of mesh in the sand analogy that I was giving earlier. So let's take human beings as something that I'm going to do a phenomenological reduction on. I'm going to think about that problem now. So I'm cogitating, you're cogitating with me. All right. So let's give this a shot. What we're going to do is attribute predicates to this thing called the human being, and then add and subtract them in our imagination to see which of these predicates we believe we can dispense with and which we believe we can not dispense with. And then we'll make two categories. The ones we can dispense with and the ones that are contingent things that we can get rid of. That's the sand we're sifting away, basically. And what's left is the essences, the things that we can't dispense with. So for example, is it true that we necessarily have to attach the following predicate to the human mind? The human mind is good at math, let's say. Is that true of every human mind? No. I'm bad at math. I know for a fact that, it's not true of every human being that they're good at math. I know plenty of people who are bad at math. Let's say I'm bad at math, and let's try another thing. So the human mind forgets birthdays. Well, that's not a predicate. Some human minds remember birthdays. How about this one? The human mind is self-conscious. Can we dispense with that? Well, not really. The human mind is intentional. Can we dispense with that? Not really. It's sort of built right into what it is to be a human mind, to be self-conscious or intentional. So what he's trying to do here is attribute a great number of predicates. And one of the problems here, it seems to many who have studied him, that there are an infinite number of predicates. And we're never going to finish the first thing we try to reduce, much less all the other reductions that are going to be, necessary to engage in this project in the first place. But at least this is an instantiation of what the guy is trying to do, to separate the necessary from the unnecessary, the inessential from the essential predicates. And once you have a whole list of essential predicates of a thing, now you know what it is. And then you get these things that are defined now as their essences, just as essential predicates. And then we start to boil that down again. So you keep on boiling down until you get a complete disclosure of what it means to be a human being. And I think this is a pretty fishy way of doing things. I had many teachers who tried to do this, and the idea of trying to figure out what it's like to be a human being inwardly, it's a very interesting thought. But it's very difficult to do in practice, and it's awfully hard to talk about these things, especially even to yourself. So the first difficulty is something like truth conditions. How do we know which of these predicates are the essential ones? For example, if you say triangles have the property of having three sides, that is an essential property of being a triangle. But that's not too controversial. But can we do the same sort of activity for the human mind? It's a bit fishier, and so we can say some things like we can have candidates like self-consciousness and intentionality, and those things are fine. But but suppose you're uncertain about that. How are you going to find out by introspection that you can be certain of those things of intentionality and self-consciousness that you yourself introspect? Again, you're getting this circular argument. You're getting stuck at a point, basically. So it's very difficult to find out about these essential properties of the human mind through introspection. And so what this reminds me of, one of the things that sort of, ruins Husserl for someone is that you have to have been, if you've been exposed to Ludwig Wittgenstein before you study Husserl, because Wittgenstein's work is a wonderful way of dissolving all these kinds of problems in a way, if you look at first glance. Again, this gets much more nuanced, but just go with me here, because Wittgenstein says he doesn't want to talk about whether, whether certain things are true or false. He says, basically, look, the whole problem is misconceived at the very beginning. And that's the real difficulty we have here, is that at the very foundation, we're misconceived. So let's think about what Husserl thinks he's doing when he finds out what the essence of a human being is. He thinks he's finding out about something about the universal structure of the human mind, basically. And that all people have to think about, because these words, these terms, these predicates like human being correspond to natural kinds in the world. And the natural kinds, in the world correspond to natural categories in human cognition. But, is that necessarily true? Well, Wittgenstein comes along and he says, basically, I want to leave the fly out of the fly bottle. Husserl is a guy walking around, or like a fly walking around inside the fly bottle, unable to get out. But here's the problem. Instead of essences being a quality intrinsic to the human mind, Wittgenstein points out that essences are a quality intrinsic to a particular language, a syntax, basically. So when you find out that self-consciousness is a necessary predicate for essence, you're not finding out some quality about the human mind intrinsically, which corresponds to essence. What you're finding out about is the way we use the word essence in the English language or in the German language. So Wittgenstein, by dissolving this, could be said, he'd just been, if he'd just been born a generation before, basically, instead of Husserl coming, a generation before, he could have saved this guy an awful lot of handwriting, because basically on his idea, and he uses, I think, one of them is games, also colors, to kind of build this anti-essentialist program. And a lot of people look at it as anti-essentialist. You could look at it as saying, well, not all predicates have some essential quality to them or correspond to some essence of a natural kind, let's say. Not all of them do, but maybe some do. And he doesn't really say it like that, but that could be one interpretation of it, one that I've not seen many people talk about, but I think could be very fruitful. But no matter the case, there is this anti-essentialist quality to Wittgenstein who could have saved Husserl a lot of time and ink in writing a lot of this thing because it just didn't work out, and so you can kind of see the point here when we're talking about Wittgenstein. So let's take another example. Maybe maybe I'll intuit this again for you. What I'm going to do is I'm buying a copy of the same paper. This doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us anything, right? Because I can buy an infinite number of copies of the same paper, and it's still not going to tell us anything. So he's trapped in this internal world, and he's a fly in a fly bottle trying to get out, but there's no way you can really get out by introspection alone, basically. And so that's the difficulty here, is that when we turn inward, we get this unmediated, symbolically unmediated knowledge of anything internal to your own psyche. The lack of those symbols, the lack of mediation between me and these objects means that it's really hard for me to talk about them later on. And that means that it comes very close to talking about yourself, and that's the opposite of what philosophy ought to be as a general sort of rigorous science that he wants it to be. So, in a way, it ends up being a betrayal of the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition by bracketing the external world so crucially. And, the idea of logos demands that knowledge not just be rational, but it also be communicable. And that's one of the canons of rationality, basically. And Husserl comes along up against the barriers of language, against the barriers of the bottle, let's say. And what Wittgenstein calls the limits of what can be said, and he'd like to step over, but he never quite manages to do it. So that's the problem that keeps coming up again and again. Now, towards the end of Husserl's life, he developed the idea of a Lebenswelt, which is called the life world, and this turn is toward the immanence of the human experience and human consciousness. So let's see if I can explain this idea. Well, what he wants to do is to look at the world as it appears to human beings, as it is given in human experience, as opposed to the impersonal, abstract experience of the world, that we get from our study of modern natural science. In other words, science tells us, for example, that time goes on indefinitely. Well, human beings don't experience time like that. They have a very limited time span in the world. And that's one of the big differences. The concrete time is human time, is your life. Abstract time is just, time T1, T2, T4, Tn, goes on forever. So in other words, science abstracts and to that extent somewhat falsifies the reality of human experience. So Husserl spends a lot of time discussing his views on time and his views on internal time consciousness. And that's the kind of thing that phenomenology would be suited to if it could get ever, off the ground, something out of it. This could be one thing. Again, the difficulty is that Husserl spends a lot of his time, most of his career, not actually doing phenomenology. He, in applying his method, and he really is trying to figure out what the heck the method is and refining it and trying to explain how it is we're going to do something later on as soon as we figure out how to do it. And so it appears, from my reading of it, but also from many others, that this has been very unsatisfactory because philosophy itself is in many respects quite nebulous. The best understanding I could come away with is this, that at some point in the indefinite future, we will find out precisely what this method is. And, mathematically Cartesian in that sense. And then after we find out precisely what the method is at some point in the indefinite future, we will then actually be able to apply it, and get some sort of results. And then after that, at some indefinite point, we're going to have all these essences and assembled them in a very lovely way, and we'll have some idea what exactly we can do with this. And I'm told initially that the whole point of it is to give us an indubitable foundation to knowledge, and I would hope that would be the case. But in the years following, since Husserl embarked on this journey and died, it seems to be more of an act of faith to a great extent, because it's very hard for him to communicate, Husserl that is, to us directly what it is we're supposed to do with this and how it is we're supposed to do it, because he never really finished getting it off the ground in the first place. And a further problem that we get out of this neo-Cartesian kind of project is the question of other minds. Descartes always had a problem, and he didn't have any problem explaining how he knew he existed himself and what his existence was like, but he always ran up against a sort of glass barrier, again, a bottle, when he tried to explain what grounds we have for believing in the reality of other people's psyche. Why is this not a kind of wilderness of objects? And he thinks that there are other minds, but he can't quite explain why or how. And Husserl is going to do something very much like that. He says, among other things, that we find out about human minds through something that is phenomenologically present to us, let's say empathy, maybe. But alas, he doesn't have a satisfactory phenomenological analysis of empathy. He kind of pounds the desk and insists that, yes, there are other minds, we can know them, and yes, we do have empathy. And to be honest, I think that's kind of a pre-philosophic kind of common sense way, not even that, but like I said, to pound the desk, basically. How else are you going to find out about other minds, given this program, It doesn't seem to me to be extremely relevant to why we need philosophy to tell us that in the first place. It's sort of obvious. And, it doesn't make sense, or at least at the very least, it doesn't make sense to have this elaborate procedure in order to be able to affirm that. And I don't think he really made progress along these lines. So that's a big issue. Even if we drop back a little bit and think about the difficulty we have here, that he wants to turn inward, he wants to talk, and he wants to turn inward, but he also wants to talk externally to other people. Well, the advantage of the Anglo-American tradition is that by concentrating on external stuff, on the public world, it's relatively easy to say what you're talking about, to refer directly to things in the world because they're public, they're external, they're here, they are, verifiable, let's say. in more than one person. But when you turn inward, it's very hard to make these questions public, or this knowledge public, let's say. And the temptation that the Anglo-American tradition has is to just abolish the eternal world, which, remember, think of the idea that we get from Locke or Hume, that the psyche is a kind of an empty box, a tabula rasa, and all the impressions get sent in, and then we associate them. And you get the association of psychology, and that's what the mind is. It's a bundle of sensations, basically. And that is, of course, it's an impoverished view of human experience. If you stop and think about it, nobody views the world and experiences the world as a bundle of sensations. And so if we follow the Anglo-American tradition exclusively, and we insist on the accuracy and precision of our speech, all we're able to talk about is the external world. Their statements about what goes on inside and other worlds, goes on inside internally. The Anglo-American empiricists can't make the jump from the outside in. And that's why their theory of the internal world is so impoverished. And it doesn't really persuade anybody. And so the Anglo-American tradition is a theory of the things that are easy to talk about. The difficulty then is that there are more things to talk about than just the external world. Everybody has an internal life, let's say, and they experience the world in that way, in probably a different way, but also in some respects very similar. And so, we feel the need to say something about those experiences, even if they are unclear and messy and nebulous. So you can see then what the Continental response to this Anglo-American tradition is like, well, you're leaving a big chunk of our experience of the world out of it, and that's the internal world. Do we have to sacrifice precision in order to enlarge the domain of discourse? Well, if that's the case, then we'll sacrifice precision a bit. And so, you don't want to give up on internal reality by exclusively going down the Anglo-American tradition. You don't want to lose that internal world, because they deny that there is an internal world. And what that sort of procedure leads to is something like behavioral psychology. Pavlov and Watson and Skinner, when there is no mind to talk about, there is no difficulty. If you follow that sort of path, what you're going to get is a very elegant and precise set of verbal canons which account for the world around us. And while that does account for some of the world around us, it doesn't do a good job of telling you about yourself. And what Husserl and the Cartesians and various, other phenomenologists say is that if you don't know yourself, how are you going to know the world? Or, what the Oracle of Delphi says, know thyself. It's a precondition of knowledge. So, but again, on the other hand, if you stay only on the inside, the difficulty then is that we are unable to get even the most basic or foundational gestures at this content across other people, or this external world around us. You know very well about your own mental states internally, but you have sometimes a hard time getting them across to other people. And so much of Wittgenstein's work is an attempt to bridge this gap, basically. But it's very, very difficult and, sometimes mysterious and sometimes startling. And what Husserl did in a kind of pounding on the desk Cartesian way is to construct the idea of the intersubjectivity. In other words, the way in which these phenomenological psyches, these transcendental egos, communicate with each other is, or the matrix which we communicate with each other is this kind of intersubjectivity, an idea which is never completely or clearly defined. And it allows us to form a sort of linguistic or verbal community with other minds. And, I kind of naively believe that there is such a thing, but Husserl isn't able to give any very satisfactory account of it. And the reason why is the structure, that I was kind of getting at a little while ago. All these Continental guys, if you look at yourself, it's hard to break out of the solipsistic circle. If you start on the inside, the problem is you can't get out of your own mind. And you started out as a mind, and so there are problems with both sides, like I mentioned. And so in many respects, you may want to think of Husserl as being a German romanticist, who's a Cartesianized romanticist, the lonely ego of Schiller or Goethe, given a sort of mathematical, Platonic, Cartesian foundation and formulation. And he insists in a kind of romantic way that I am a self, I know I am conscious, and I can't doubt that. That's a matter of fact. On this rock I will build my church. Well, I can see how you might have a certain desire to do that, and maybe we all might. Maybe that's a essential part of the human experience. But the problem is that we're always going to end up either talking to ourselves or constructing arbitrary commonsensical bridges from our philosophical solipsism into the regular external world of everyday praxis. And that's built into the idea of this project that all the Continental thinkers are involved with. So I should have got this earlier, but what I'm asking for in some respect is that you cut the Continental philosophers a bit of slack, because they are doing something that is, a project that needs to be undertaken, but it's probably impossible. And, it may just well be impossible to talk about internal facts of my psychic state, or that it's so difficult to do, and it leaves a great deal of cloudiness, messiness, and it's not a particular problem with Husserl, but this Continental, this inward first method in general. And so, but if you start out with the external world, you're never going to get a sense of yourself. You're never going to like the Anglo-American tradition. You're never going to be able to talk about these internal facts, and that means you will have an impoverished, vocabulary or an account of our own experience. And so just to kind of reiterate, to give you one last example here, one last analogy, let's say, between the difference between the two, to make this more apparent, the difference. So try the idea of going to get a tailor and getting a suit of clothes made. It's a simple everyday thing, maybe not as common anymore, but you go to a tailor and they measure you. You come back the next week and they give you your clothes that are, supposedly of perfect fit. And you put on the jacket and you find that the jacket only has one arm. And the tailor says, well, if your jacket only has one arm, your body is wrong. You should only have one arm. And the customer might well say, no, hold on. Let me get this straight now. My body is wrong and your suit is right. That's insane. You're missing you're missing an arm, a sleeve, basically. So in other words, my body starts out being right. I'm sure that this is how I'm shaped, and if you only have one sleeve in your jacket, change the jacket. The jacket is wrong. Your body's not wrong. If the tailor says, no, that's absurd, you just have to remove your arm, that's crazy. You're not going to go remove your arm. So in other words, do we change our body to suit our jacket, or do we change our jacket to suit our body? And so I want to suggest that our body is a set of experiences, and that the jacket is the philosophical theory of which we account for them. Do you really want to cut off your experiences of cause and effect, of good and evil, of lust, rage, love, hatred, beauty, because you can't talk about them precisely? Or is this demand of philosophical precision taken to an unreasonable extreme? And so, in other words, when A.J. Ayer, he has this view, this moral theory is non-cognitive, basically. But when I experience morals, at least sometimes, as being real, and right and wrong, if these Anglo-American guys, these real hard-shell empiricists, tell me that my experience is wrong, it's like a tailor telling me my body is wrong and I need to cut off an arm. Don't tell me that I'm experiencing the world wrong. Your theory is wrong. And if it doesn't correspond to my experience, then we need to fix the theory. Don't tell me to fix my experience, because my experiences come first. And now you can see the strength of Husserl's point here. This is his point, basically. And this is a sort of, devastating argument to the empiricists that in my perspective, in my view, is true. He has a point here. So in other words, I think Husserl's attempt to find a way out of this labyrinth doesn't work, right? He's spinning his wheels, but he's on the right track in terms of the problem that we need to address. And that is, if you only look at the external world, if you only look at that, and you try to fit your experiences into it, you're going to be missing a sleeve. And so, that's kind of Husserl's slogan, that we need to start with the body first and then try to make a theory fit. But he just doesn't bridge that gap. But the slogan would be something like this, that experience comes first. Let's start with experience and, me first, basically. And then I'll construct my world around that, the external world around that. But I'm not going to construct myself around the world. That's insane. It's changing your body. It's cutting off an arm to fit the suit that only has one sleeve. And so that's the strong point of Husserl. And if it doesn't ultimately offer us intuition of the essence of being, whatever that is he's trying to do here, it doesn't offer us the ultimate structure of human cognition, but it does give us the right problem to be solved, basically. It does make an important point against the problem that Western philosophy has drifted into, that it would rather pass the buck on and not have to address. And so, but phenomenology tried to address that problem, even if it didn't really get, at least with Husserl, didn't get off the ground. We can argue maybe later on there was this big development that this methodology uses, but it is nonetheless a very interesting tradition. So let's conclude here. It's this problem, the starting point of the internal world. It gets nebulous and fuzzy, and that's just kind of sort of built into the problem they're trying to solve. Let's not shy away from it. Let's try to, if we have to give up some precision in order to address the problems that the internal world brings us, that's left out by the empiricist and only having public knowledge, that doesn't make it any less significant or interesting of a problem. We can still, do something about that. And even if they have, the empiricists, even if they have better diction or vocabulary or more precise terms, if we have to get into the messiness, the nebulous, dubious internal world, that's what we need to do in order to push philosophy forward, in order to have a full suit, basically, and not a jacket with a missing arm or pants with a missing leg. We have the body and we have the perfect suit to go with that body. So that's it for Husserl. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm out.